So let me introduce our speaker. Professor Byron Johnson is a distinguished professor of the social sciences at Baylor University. He is also director of the Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion. He has a PhD in criminology from Florida State University. He directed, before going to Baylor, he directed research centers at Vanderbilt University and the University of Pennsylvania. He was a member of the Coordinating Council for Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. He is the author of, or co-author of the Angola Prison Seminary, and also co-author of The Quest for Purpose, the Collegiate Search for a Meaningful Life. So he is going to be telling us about the effect of religious organizations on the public good, and it's a delight to have him come. So, Professor Johnson.
I can advance the slides with this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Richard. Well, it's good to be here for my first time to BYU. What a beautiful place. It's an honor to be here. I have to acknowledge Stephen Craney, who's sitting here. This is, believe it or not, a postdoc at my shop at Baylor who's here at BYU. We do things creatively at Baylor, and one of those is to allow someone like Stephen to actually be in residence here while he's still finishing up the last year of a postdoc at ISR. Well, let me hop right into it here, and I may want to stand here to the side so I can see that screen. There we go. This is just a look at newspaper articles on the topic of religion. And I thought it might be helpful for some of you to see the news coverage. If you just kind of Google the headlines to see what's in the news on religion, I was trying to find some positive stories. As you can see, these are all negative stories. I couldn't find any positive stories in the headlines. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are those by Christian organizations, and even those stories are negative. The data, by the way, is in the right column, and as you can see, some of these have no data at all, but they still print negative stories. So these are some of the headlines that you may have heard mentioned about religion. It's kind of fascinating. I've heard people use many of these actually from pulpits, especially this one towards the bottom, that atheism is on the rise. I've heard one pastor say that atheism has increased tenfold in the last 10 years alone. And then you see these other facts, supposed facts on this screen. Those are all false. There's no empirical evidence for any of those things, but yet you hear them quite often. And a lot of those appear in the headlines that I showed just the screen before. These are the headlines that you don't hear about religion. And there is evidence for each of these. So it's a pretty lopsided story. I will say that there was a USA Today article after Harvey hit Texas about the response of the faith community to Harvey. It was one of the only articles that you'll ever see of a disaster relief story that gives positive press to the media, to faith-based groups. I will actually talk about a number of these, what I call good news about religion headlines in the presentation today. And let me know if you can't hear me. So I just wanted to start out by kind of summarizing. I know today we had some great sessions where people focused on a particular project. I'm going to scan hundreds of studies for you over the next 25 minutes or so, just to kind of give you a picture of what we're learning about the influence of religion in our society. And if you just look at a couple of those, I don't know if you know this or not, but we're in the middle of a serious drug epidemic in the U.S. right now. People are scratching their heads in Washington, D.C. about what to do about it, so are people at the state level. Depression is a huge problem. Suicide also has spiked in recent years. And these are just a host of problems that we deal with right now in the country, and we have dealt with for some time. Does religion have any effect on these things? It absolutely does. These are hundreds of studies that have been published on the role of religion, and all of those things, the tall column you see, represent studies that find an inverse relationship Where there's more religious commitment, there's less hypertension. Where there's more religious commitment, people tend to live longer. If you're white, it tends to add 7 years to your life expectancy if you practice your faith. If you're African American, more like 14 years. This is just the other side of that equation, pro-social kinds of things which people sometimes don't focus on. We seem to focus on the negative, but if you look at that, a similar kind of a literature emerges where it shows that faith helps in these areas. So now let's talk about some of those headlines. One of those headlines was this: religion in America is going away, God is dead, or God's on life support. What we do know is there is a massive decline in organized religion in America, but it's taking place in the mainline Protestant denominations. And this is a pattern that's been around for decades. Even though you won't hear this, what you'll hear is that membership in the U.S., church membership is in decline. It is, but it's not across the board. You also hear that church attendance is in decline. Also not true. If you look at data going back to 1954, you bring it all the way up to the early 2000s, you see some fluctuations there, but not that huge at all, and there's a way in which we can explain that. There are current studies coming out that indicate church attendance is lower than the 36%, but I will make the case today that most of the surveys that we're now seeing are worthless. Because the response rate is so low as to make them meaningless. And how in the world they're getting away with it is beyond me. And so I'll talk about that in a few more minutes as well. These are 3 surveys that have been done to address this issue of something called the nuns, the increase in the nuns. These are people that have no religious affiliation. A lot of people refer to the nuns as atheists or agnostics. The ERIS survey, and then the Pew survey, then the Baylor survey, which I'll mention. The ERIS survey is what we call an omnibus survey. They ask questions about everything from which car do you drive to what's your favorite candy bar, or what's your favorite dressing for salad. Oh, and then they ask this question: what is your religion? That's the only question that's asked on the survey. There are no categories. You're just supposed to fill in the blank. And they've done this survey 3 different times. And because the response, they have 7% that say in 1990, all the way up to 2008, those that indicate no religion has increased. So that's one indication given for the fact that the nuns are on the rise. Then the Pew Landscape Study received an enormous amount of attention a few years ago. What they reported was that 44% of Americans have left the faith of their youth. That's actually not what the study showed at all. What the study showed is that 44% of Americans do not attend the denomination they were raised in. They did not, quote, leave the faith. If you look a little closer, what you find out is a lot of people actually attend more Orthodox or conservative congregations than the ones that they were raised in. So the idea of being in a pluralistic society, people shop around for faith because it's so important. If they don't like the church that they're going to, if they don't have a children's program, they'll go find one that does offer it to them. In the Baylor survey, we asked a bunch of questions, not one, we asked close to 400 questions. This is going back to 2006, 2007, about religion, when we did this with the Gallup organization, and we published a bunch of studies. We had the whole issue of this journal, the flagship journal. That's one of the things that you'll find problematic in so much of the stuff that you hear in the headlines. If you look for footnotes, there are no footnotes because a lot of it is a guess or an estimate, but it's not published in any academic journal, which is, I think, problematic. And these are just some publications and got a lot of attention, surprisingly. I think the only reason why we did is we threw questions in there about, do you believe in Bigfoot, do you believe in ghosts, and these kinds of things, and of course the media is interested in that. And what you find out, by the way, is if people don't attend, if they don't indicate that they're religious, they're much more likely to believe in Bigfoot. People who actually go to church don't believe in Bigfoot. So it's the classic idea that if you don't believe in anything, if you don't believe in God, you'll believe in anything, is what they seem to find. And of course, they're anxious to publish this in those kinds of publications. Now, this is just page 1 of a survey for those academics in here. You're very familiar with this. This is with Gallup. And on the left-hand column, you see denominations listed there. So we asked people in that first question, what is your religious family? And if you look down, you probably can't see it because it's too small. Towards the bottom, it says no religion. So you can just mark that box, or you don't feel comfortable there, you can put other, or you can go down below that and hit don't know. So everybody does this typically on surveys. And so where are they getting the nones from? The don't know, the other, the no religion, that's where they're kind of figuring out those people are nones. But if you look a little closer, we also ask them if they can tell us a little bit about their denomination, in addition to the religious family. So if you put Baptist, there are more than 27 different kinds of Baptists. So you need to ask a little bit more to find out what kind of Baptist church people go to. And then if you go on down, we ask people to identify themselves if they find themselves on a list. Are you evangelical? Are you Pentecostal, etc.? But then if you go on and look on the next page, we ask people, can you provide for us the name of a church that you go to? And then we ask them, can you even give us an address? So here's what we find that indicates the data that you hear about a lot of times with nuns is deeply problematic. We find that 30% of those that say they don't know their religion actually gave us a congregation. That seems a little bizarre, doesn't it? And then about 10% who indicated they had no religion also provided us with a congregation, gave us an address. So why is this happening? So let's just say you go to, have you heard of Saddleback Church? This is Rick Warren's church. I would imagine if you survey this congregation, you'd find that most people don't know it's a Southern Baptist congregation. They don't list it that way, but it is. Rick Warren's a Southern Baptist Convention pastor. And so if people don't see their affiliation listed, I attend Church of the Savior. What is that? I don't know what it is. I just attend there. Oh, you didn't know? It's Presbyterian Church of America. Oh, okay, because we don't put that on the outside of the church. So what's happening is the nuns are being inflated dramatically, and even though we've published studies to alter that finding, it still seems to carry the headline. This is a publication that comes out every 10 years that looked, and you can see it's coded by county. So if 50% of a county has a membership in one way, so let's just say you see the red there in the southeast, that's Baptist. So if over 50% of the people in a county are Baptist, then that county gets shaded red, and then it gets lighter or darker as that grows. So you can see, I didn't do the whole country, but you can see the whole country. You can see where Catholics are strong, and you can see where Mormons are strong just by looking at this map. I've always loved this. I've tracked this for decades, but we've always thought, a number of us, this isn't doing justice to a lot of congregations. They're not getting captured because what they do is they have relationships. Those names of the individuals that you see there have relationships with denominations, and they get data from them. But that doesn't mean they get data from all denominations. So our concern was that certain groups are being left out. So according to this document, there are 350,000 congregations in the United States. And I'll tell you why this is an important subject to be talking about, because I believe that these congregations have enormous impact on society, even if you just look at the economic impact of them. So there's 350,000 of them. Well, what we did, let me go back up. So what we did was we just completed 3 studies, one in Richmond, Virginia, one in Bellingham, Washington, and one in Waco, where we actually did, you've heard of these Google cars that go around, they take a picture of everything. So we got in a car and we drove around and took a photograph of every church. If it's a huge mega church, or if it's a storefront, used to be a 7-Eleven, now it's a congregation with no signage. And then we'd ask people, do you know of any more churches, just to see if we could find more. We found that they overlooked 40% of the congregations in Waco. Then we did it in Bellingham, Washington, same thing. And we're just getting the data back from Richmond, and it's closer to 50% of the congregations are missed. What are they missing? African American congregations, Latino congregations, charismatic Pentecostal congregations are completely being overlooked in the data. So we think there is very likely more like 500,000 congregations in the U.S. And if you think that these congregations are having benefits or what we would call a halo effect in their communities, it's the enormous impact that they have. And Ram Kannan at the University of Pennsylvania has done some of this work in Philadelphia to find that the congregations are producing enormous social services at no cost. This is a book that I did a few years ago, and I told you all those areas where we know religion is having an impact. This is in the area of drug and alcohol studies and delinquencies. So delinquency studies that I've reviewed, and this is the effect that you see religion has. Religion keeps people out of trouble, and once they get into trouble, it helps them stay out of trouble. And those studies are summarized in that book. This is a book that came out a year ago, just about a year ago to the day, where we studied a prison in Louisiana. It's the Louisiana State Penitentiary. It's a maximum security prison housing over 6,000 prisoners. It's been known for decades as the bloodiest prison in America, totally corrupt. All the correctional officers just about were corrupt. And in 1995, a warden went there, and that's just here's a picture of some of the prison. See what it looks like. It's a horrible place. And so a warden goes there. This is just the entrance to the facility. This warden goes there in 1995 and starts a Bible college in the prison to see if it would help the prison. I mean, why not try it? And as you were talking about, there's a prison that's here local that they're going to be moving, which I hate to hear, because that's the tendency, is to put prisons in remote locations where unfortunately we can't get people in there to provide the services that they need. So the best thing you can do would be to have a prison in your backyard so that you could help them. And a lot of prisons, of course, they've slashed all the programs because of budget cuts, and they don't have programs. The only programs that exist in a lot of prisons are provided by the faith community. And this, though, takes it to another level where it's actual Bible college going in. So this warden pitched the idea. The money came in. It was all raised privately to launch. By the way, these are some alligators. If you do escape, it's like Alcatraz. You know, it's not like you'll die in a heavy current in the Bay Area, but you'll get eaten by an alligator. So this is the Bible college there on the grounds, all raised for private funds. This is just a signage. You can see down, this is Philippians 3:13 and 14, this passage on the sign, but the ACLU was threatening to cause some issues, and so they put some white out over the scriptural reference there, and the ACLU dropped the case. This is just a picture of an inmate class going on at the seminary. These are just the library, another class going on. This is an inmate pastor. So these guys actually not only go to Bible college, they get trained, and then they have 29 congregations in the prison itself with complete staff. And this is just one of the pastors. It is the most ecumenical environment I've ever been in, because those are all different denominations that are represented in the prison. The guy in the middle here is leading their vocational shop. And you know, this is in remote, backward Louisiana, where they have more vocational programs going on than any prison I've ever been in, and I've been in prisons for 30 years now. The guy that you see in the middle there, serving life, most of the guys are serving life without parole. So they're dying in prison. In Louisiana, they don't have parole. This is a cemetery. They bury about 3 people per month. There's another shot of the cemetery. This is the hospice unit run by inmates that have gone through the Bible college. What's happened over the last 20 years, we got a big grant to study it, so it's a 5-year study, and it's remarkable. People being stabbed regularly it was not uncommon at all. I mean, we interviewed inmates that were in their 80s that said they used to go to bed at night, put stuff over them so that they would get, in case someone tried to stab them during the night. Suicide's very common. 0 suicides. Institutional violations down. The inmates so this is an inmate serving life you see here, ministering to another inmate that's dying who's serving life. I could go on and on about the prison. It has become just a completely different place. And now people are coming from all over the country to backward Louisiana to find out how you took the worst prison in America and made it into something like this. And they're trying to start Bible colleges. Of course, and this is one of the congregations. This is another congregation. This is the newest one. This is a Catholic chapel that was built 2 years ago. Another chapel. These are missionaries. So they send out ministers to other prisons in Louisiana as missionaries to take the gospel. I have a video. I'm not going to show it. It's very powerful, but there's just not enough time. What happens in a nutshell with this program, and the reason why it's so important, is these inmates wind up giving their life away. They wind up serving all the other inmates as they go through the Bible college. So one of the problems is people come in and the warden, who kind of reminds me of the character Boss Hogg in the old show Dukes of Hazzard, he can't understand a word he says. The accent is that strong. And he says, just go start a Bible college and it'll fix your prison. And when we did the research, we came back to the warden and we showed him what we came up with. He couldn't argue with us. It's the Bible college, but it's unleashing and empowering the prisoners to serve the other prisoners. That's transforming the whole place. And that story is not being told. And other prisons are coming in, and all over the country they're launching Bible colleges, but they don't have the recipe. The recipe is to empower the inmates to lead by serving, but they won't allow that in any of the other prisons across the country because they won't allow an inmate to have authority over another inmate, even though they'll tell you it's the power to serve that they're interested in. And I won't go into this. This is just some of the statistical stuff that we did to publish papers. And let me fly through this to get to some other stuff. It's being replicated in Texas, and we're studying that prison. It's already showing effects there. This is another faith-based program. And it gets back to the civic engagement thing. This is the most innovative program I've seen. It's the prison entrepreneurship program. This is where business executives go into prison to volunteer, and they take inmates and help them develop business plans. Those business plans are then evaluated and scored by MBA students across the country, including MIT and Harvard, Berkeley, UCLA, Baylor, other top schools are involved in scoring the business plans of these inmates that get out and start their own companies. It's pretty amazing. Another faith-based idea. This is where a bunch of faith-based groups in West Dallas, you may not have heard of West Dallas, but West Dallas was one of the most blighted communities in the United States. Just one big massive housing project in the 1960s. It has been completely transformed, not that it's done. I mean, there's still work to be done, but we did a study highlighting the role of 13 different faith-based organizations to help transform that blighted community into something that's thriving. This is our most recent study that we just did on homelessness. Everybody knows that homelessness is a problem across the country. We wanted to see how faith-based groups respond, and you can get this online. I'll give you the address in a second. We looked at 11 cities across the country. These are the 11 cities. And we looked at these organizations that you see on this screen, just those organizations. We did not look at all organizations. We just didn't have the time or resources. And we did not look at congregations. And what we found is that about 60% of all the beds provided to the homeless are provided by faith-based groups. And so they're saving the government hundreds of millions of dollars. These are the kinds of stories that you never hear about. The Gospel Rescue Mission there on the top, they get regularly offered big dollars if they'll get rid of their faith commitment. If you'll get rid of the Bibles, we'll give you money. And they have said, why would we want to get rid of the one thing that's helping us serve the least of these? I'll skip through some of these other findings from that. This is just a study that we did of volunteers, speaking of civic engagement, that go into prisons and lead inmate Bible studies. Does it reduce recidivism? It actually does. This is published in one of the top journals in criminology. This is another study where we looked at people who, volunteers that go into prison just to visit prisoners, right? Guess where those what we find is if you get visits, you're less likely to come back to prison versus guys that don't get visits. Where do the volunteers come from? Congregations. This is just a meta that we did. And one of the earlier presentations today talking about building relationships with legislators, which I couldn't agree more about that. But one of the things that we don't do a good job of as scholars is how do you write papers in academic journals that are full of equations that most people aren't going to read. So every now and again we try to publish in the Wall Street Journal or do something like this, write for a publication that has 20,000 members, people who actually work inside so that they can see that these things actually are meaningful. And then I'll kind of start wrapping it up here with this. We've published about 6 papers in the last 18 months on faith-based drug treatment. And what we're finding there, some of you won't be surprised, others of you will. These are teens. Teens that find God, it helps them, but it doesn't keep them sober. Teens who find God and help other teens that are in treatment stay sober. So it's faith and service together that actually keep them out. This is a longitudinal study. It's really rigorous project, and these are just more studies that we've published. I mean, it's amazing. Even kids with social anxiety disorder. I mean, most of the drug treatment that goes on in correctional facilities is 12-step. It's group things. But if you have social anxiety disorder, you can't even get up in front of people to talk. So how's that going to work? But what we find is if they connect to God and serve others, it completely wipes out the effect of social anxiety. And a significant number of kids have it. This is just more of the same. This is a friend of mine. He's a pastor in Dorchester, outside of Boston. He was on the cover of Newsweek in the late 1990s because he and a handful of African Americans decided to do something about the high homicide rate among gang members, and they drove the homicide rate down to 0 for a couple of years straight, and they got a lot of attention about that. And not long after that, this cover ran in U.S. News and World Report. Can the faith factor save us from all of our problems? I'd be naive to say that is the case. I think this is a piece I did not too long ago saying it's all about partnerships and relationships where the government and the faith community working together can tackle a lot of problems, and there's evidence that has happened. And this is just the latest book. We actually got all of the studies that you see are funded. We do a lot of grants. This was a recent grant from the Templeton Foundation. We were actually studying cheating. Who cheats in college and who doesn't? That was what we were funded to study. And one of the things that we found is that kids who had a purpose in life didn't cheat. And kids that didn't have a purpose were much more likely to cheat. You think it's kind of simple. And then what's the big connection behind purpose is their faith. And so anyways, this just came out a couple of weeks ago. These are just some more recent publications too on these topics. I won't go into all of them, but you can find them here at this website, and maybe I'll stop and open it up for questions.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I've got a question for you. On the survey that you listed up there, you listed the Mormon faith or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as you just put Latter-day Saints. I was intrigued by that instead of not using the whole proper name. But on your scale, when you talked about conservative religions, where does the Mormon faith fall into? Is it on that scale? Is it what you call as a conservative one that the kids and congregations are gravitating to? And, you know, when you talked about Rick's church, I was thinking about Joel Osteen.
Joel Osteen?
Yeah, Osteen.
Yeah.
Is his, also, I guess the second question, is his associated with the?
His church is fascinating. One of the things I think I do too much is criticize too many of these people, right? You see this guy on television, you think he's a loser. So I went down there. I was in Houston. I thought, I'm going to go to this church. My wife went with me. Because they have the prosperity gospel.
Right.
And I've never been greeted by so many people in my life as I was. And so when we got there, the arena was full with 15,000 people. We were waiting. So they emptied, and we went in, and it filled back up. And, you know, just when you move that many people, you kind of think, how does that happen without a stampede? So it was very, very organized. People were friendly. And I guess I left, and it was a very diverse congregation. So, I mean, I was observing a lot of people around me. So I left there much less critical than when I went there. But the way we try to study these congregations, we try to divide them into different groups, you know, by looking at, you know, are they evangelical, are they this, are they that? And there are ways in which you can define these groups that are in the literature. So for example, what is an evangelical? There are plenty of people that would say, I'm not an evangelical, but okay, so do you believe in the Bible? Do you think it's important to share your faith with other people? Do you think that Jesus Christ is necessary for salvation? When you ask these, you know, it's important to share your faith. Yeah, okay, you're an evangelical. Well, some people aren't comfortable with that title, just like they're not comfortable with the title fundamentalist. So, you know, it just depends. You know, if you look at that chart, we actually had evangelical. A lot of people don't identify as an evangelical, and almost no one identifies as a fundamentalist anymore, because there's, you know, it's such a negative term, at least in the media. I remember one time a guy, I heard them bashing in the sociology department at one of the universities. They were just saying all these horrible things about people that have conservative theology, and they called them these fundamentalists. And I walked up on the conversation. I said, I'm one of those. Oh, no, you're not. No, you're not. They're all trying to convince me. It was so interesting that I wasn't one of them. But I said, yeah, I believe in those kinds of things. But at any rate, so I think on the Latter-day Saints, I think that was just a space issue where we were trying to save space. But I'm not quite certain on that. And so the Mormons fall into that kind of evangelical category. They tend to. Yes.
About the churches, especially in the South. I know I have friends that belong to those churches, and I've had family members that have talked about them. But I've also noticed recently on social media that there's been a lot of talks of like how pastors and people that are on the leadership board kind of take advantage of their congregations' financial status, where they convince them that all the that they're doing is to better the community, and that they are so strong and devout and religious that the congregation members, even though they don't have much, they will find it in them to donate something that they really should be. And the pastor doesn't put it to good use. And so I noticed that you said that they a lot of those churches do help the communities, but how have you seen that being on
Yeah. Well, it doesn't take much time or much effort when you go into these congregations to see all the social services that they have. One of the things we like to do is to go into a congregation and see what benevolence ministries do you have? What do those look like? Can you list them all? Some of them, if you put a list in front of them, oh, we have that, yes, we have that, yes, we have that, yes, we have that. They have so many ministries, a lot of them, that they can't even keep track of all of them. This doesn't mean that there isn't going to be abuse. I mean, a lot of people, especially the elderly, they're shut-ins, they watch these people, they live on fixed incomes, and they send in money to these folks. How is that money accounted for? I don't know about that. But I do know that a significant portion of the philanthropy. Americans give $387 billion a year in philanthropy. And a lot of that comes from the faith community. And a lot of it goes overseas to do work outside of the U.S. So there's a whole generosity literature that's pretty amazing. So to answer your question, I don't know there's any good research on the financial accountability of pastors. We can't even find out how many churches there are because so many of the black churches are being left out of the statistics. So there's really need for rigorous research. I mean, think about it. I mentioned Rick Warren's church. They have 3,000 small groups, but no research on that. You heard the Salvation Army, you saw that? No research in the Salvation Army. None. And we were talking about earlier the importance of research for public policy. The reality is there's next to no research on so many different areas right now that it's staggering. And so we do need a lot more research to see if these groups are effective, and if they aren't, could they? Or if they are effective, how much more effective could they be? One of the things that we're talking about with the new president, provost at Baylor, is launching a new center called the Center for Effective Compassion, where we would basically hold these groups to a measure of accountability that they're not held to right now. I mean, World Vision gets so much money. Red Cross, I don't know if you follow the news, but Red Cross was resoundingly criticized for their response to the hurricanes. And yet, they're the ones that received more money than anybody because it was on the bottom of the screen, even though they were the ones that were criticized by the mayors and the people on the ground for their lack of response. So yeah, we definitely need accountability. I know I'm over, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Please.
Appreciate it.